Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll continue our exploration of the book The Idea of the World. But before we start, let's recap quickly what we did last time. So in my last video, I introduced Kostrup's line of argument, which we summarized in 12 statements. We also talked about dissociation and alters, because one of the fundamental arguments is that humans and other living organisms are all dissociated alters from universal mind, meaning universal consciousness is fragmented into individual conscious entities. I showed you two different graphs that visualize how one is to understand dissociation in this context. Those graphs pointed to the way we are all mentally differentiated from universal mind. I thought that was quite plausible. We also touched on the notion that matter is not diametrically opposed to mind, as our mainstream materialist paradigm likes to suggest, but that matter is a phase or mode of mind. So mind is the fundamental property of the universe, and everything material is ultimately made of mind. To me, that is all very plausible so far. I can wrap my head around all that. In fact, I find this worldview much more plausible than the materialist one. If I understand Kostrup right, then we are manifestations from mind, and so is everything in the world around us. I was thinking about this quite a lot lately, and it always helps me to make a drawing when I try to understand something. So, when we go back to our metaphor of the ocean and the waves, this is the outline I came up with to explain all this to myself. You have the ocean, which is mind in our metaphor. Instead of mind, you could say a proto-conscious field of energy or an information field. And the ocean or field can get excited, meaning it can take on different vibratory rates or it can vibrate on different frequencies. And there can be waves of excitation. And it is the tip of the waves that produce interference patterns. The tips of the waves are our physical bodies, the manifestations in this four-dimensional reality that we usually call world. That is just my simple way of explaining to myself what is happening. What I would like to look at more closely in this episode is how, according to Kostrup, such manifestation comes to pass, and how we can differentiate an intrinsic and extrinsic world of experience. So we will look at that in the context of Kostrup's philosophy. Also, I'd like to investigate the difference between thoughts, perceptions, and experiences, because that to me is not quite clear yet. Finally, I'll touch on the question of whether consciousness in artificial intelligence is possible and what Kostrup has to say about that. Let's take up that concept of dissociation again. Because you could say all that stuff about mind and mental states is just a figment of the imagination and has nothing to do with the physical world. Well, it turns out that this is not so. Mind or mental states and physicality are closely related. Kostrup uses an example of a woman who had dissociative identity disorder involving various distinct personalities. Some of the personalities this woman exhibited were blind and some weren't. So if the woman would assume one of those personalities or alters, she couldn't see, and if she assumed another, she could see. Now they performed an EEG on her while she assumed those different personalities, and the recorded brain activity showed that while the blind alter was in control of the woman's body, there was no brain activity associated with sight, whereas while the seeing alter was in the control of the body, there was recorded brain activity of areas associated with sight. In another case, the scientists took brain scans of a dissociative person, and they were able to find significant differences between the scans of various dissociated alters. This is where Kastrup's statement, "Dissociation has extrinsic appearance," comes from. It means that whatever is going on at the level of mind also shows in the physical. Or we can say that when we see differences, separation, and diversity in the external world, those are external manifestations of a more fundamental mental reality. In other words, when Kastrup talks about dissociation having extrinsic appearance, he says that the diversity and separateness we perceive in the world around us are not inherent properties of an external objective reality, but instead they are projections or appearances generated by the dissociation of a fundamental unified consciousness. The external world, as we experience it, is a kind of representation of mind, and the apparent distinctions between objects and entities are not fundamental to reality, but rather surface-level manifestations of a deeper and interconnected consciousness. The Markov blanket is a concept from probability theory and statistics, where it is used to describe the boundary that separates a set of variables from the rest of the variables in a system. To put it simply, the Markov blanket is a concept that helps us distinguish things from other things. In the philosophy of mind, this concept is applied to suggest that certain entities or aspects of consciousness act as a kind of boundary or separation, giving rise to the illusion of individuality and independence. In the context of analytic idealism and Bernardo Kastrup's philosophy, the Markov blanket is employed as a metaphor to discuss the apparent separation or dissociation of individual entities within the overall unity of consciousness. So what does the Markov blanket concept entail? It's actually two things. It's a way to differentiate between internal and external from the point of view of a subsystem, and the idea of a relative or conditional independence of the subsystem from the overall system. Let's use another graph to illustrate this. So in this graph, we have a bunch of states symbolized by circles, and we have causal dependencies symbolized by arrows. Let's say the blue circle is an internal state. The Markov blanket would be the states in orange surrounding the internal state in blue. So inside the Markov blanket, we have the states that equal a subsystem, like, for instance, an individual mind. And outside the Markov blanket, we have the external states that are not considered part of that subsystem. As you can see by the way the arrows point to the circles, the internal blue state inside the orange Markov blanket is independent of the external states in light green outside the blanket. And their condition is determined entirely by the variables given within the Markov blanket. Inside the Markov blanket, we can further differentiate between sensory states, here in pink, and active states, here in red. And this is how you can explain the exchange mechanism between a subsystem and its surrounding system. Say, for instance, this blue circle is your brain, with all your neural synapses firing away. Those synapses get triggered by sensory data arriving through your sensory organs. The sensory data would be the sensory states in pink, and they produce actions, such as muscle actions, here indicated in red, leading you to, for instance, punch someone else in the face, and thus influencing external states in turn. Your internal state in blue is influenced by your senses processing sensory data in pink, and your internal state makes you do things in red, which influences states outside of you in light green. The sensory and active states combined are your Markov blanket. I copied these graphs from a video by Professor Carl Friston, and I will link the video in the description box below. So, in the context of consciousness and analytic idealism, the Markov blanket is useful to distinguish between an individual's internal consciousness states and external states. The aspects of consciousness that are within the Markov blanket refer to your individual's subjective experiences, for instance your thoughts or perceptions, and the aspects of consciousness that are outside the Markov blanket are considered the external world. That could be other minds or anything perceived as separate from the individual consciousness. I think at this point in our inquiry, you would be able to appreciate Kastrup's statement, "We are conscious centers of experience within the otherwise unitary universal consciousness." Now let's try and differentiate the terms perception and experience next. Perception and experience are related concepts, but they refer to different aspects of our interaction with the world. Perception is the process by which organisms interpret and make sense of sensory information from the environment. It involves the reception, the interpretation, and the organization of sensory stimuli such as sight, sound, touch, taste, and smell. Perception is a complex cognitive process that involves the brain's processing of sensory input to give it meaning. It is influenced by factors such as your past experiences, your cultural background, and also individual differences. So if we go back to the concept of the Markov blanket, perception is where an outside state impinges on your Markov blanket. Pertaining to an individual, inside the Markov blanket would be the combination of sensory organs, so your eyes, your ears, and neural processes involved in perception, as well as your internal mental states and representations. And outside the Markov blanket would be external stimuli from the environment, objects, events, or phenomena in the external world. So the dissociative boundary between the inside and outside of the Markov blanket is where perception occurs. Experience is a broader term that encompasses the overall accumulation of knowledge, skills, and awareness gained throughout one's life. It includes not only sensory perceptions, but also emotional, cognitive, and social elements. Experiences can be both conscious and unconscious, and are shaped by various factors including perception, memory, and cultural context. Experiences contribute to the development of your worldview, your understanding of the world. So, perception is a component of experience. In Kastrup's view, the physical is a particular category of experience. It isn't stuff that is out there on its own right, independent of any observation, but it is excitations of universal mind that occur at the boundaries between alters and the surrounding universal mind. I personally found the following image helpful to sort of picture that concept. Imagine those are two centers of individual consciousness, or alters, as Kastrup calls them. They are themselves excitations of the underlying ocean, and by their excitation, they create interference patterns. And it is the interference patterns that give rise to materiality. That is how I try to picture this mechanism. Now the point is that these excitations are perceptions themselves, and all perceptions are in mind, which is why physical stuff ultimately is mind as well. Now, similarly to the exercise last time, I tried to distill the essence of Kastrup's arguments by selecting 9 consecutive statements to drive this point home. I will just prompt these statements now one after the other, and I will also put them in the description box below for your reference. According to idealism, consciousness is the fundamental reality. So consciousness can not be created because it already underlies all of nature. Kastrup says universal consciousness is that within which all creation happens and out of which all creation is made. So let's take that as our fundamental assumption when discussing AI. Before answering the question, can AI be conscious, we need to define what we mean by AI. Kastrup puts it this way. He says, strong artificial intelligence is the engineering of an entity with separate, private, conscious inner life, like yours and mine. So, in the context of Kastrup's theory, that would mean to artificially induce dissociation in universal consciousness and thereby create an artificial alter or center of consciousness in universal mind. According to Kastrup, even if we managed to artificially create a functioning, biological nervous system, this would merely be the external appearance. Let's assume we created an AI that looks like a human being and has a functioning nervous system like a human being. We would look at this external appearance and assume it has an inner conscious life just like ours. But really, it is just a lookalike, a hull, mimicking the patterns of information flow. So Kastrup says by mimicking the appearance, we are not reproducing the inner experience as well. What we would try to do is create life from inanimate matter when the starting point of life really is in mind. So short answer, no. According to Kastrup, AI cannot be conscious. I will link a discussion between Bernardo Kastrup, Donald Hoffman and Susan Schneider regarding this topic in the description box below for those of you who would like to know more. I don't know about you, but I found the introduction of the Markov Blanket quite helpful, and I'm clearer on how idealists conceive of the physical world. It is a stretch for us to get into this line of thought because we are so used to the materialist paradigm and because it's so pervasive. I first came in contact with the idealist view when I turned to Buddhism in my early 20s. And later, when I got into quantum physics, I found the idealist philosophy more convincing and more suitable as a basic framework to understand quantum physical concepts. But no matter which philosophy you personally ascribe to, I find it is important to hear different points of view. In the next episode, we will look at the remaining chapters of the book, and we will probably look into the unconscious. We might talk about evidence from neuroscience and also psychedelics. I hope this video was helpful to you. If it was, please consider giving it a like and do subscribe for more such content. I'll see you next time. Bye.